1966 marks a transformative time for pop music. The Beatles performed their final concert in August and then became the comfortable studio wizards they'd remain for the rest of their career. The Beach Boys redefined the limits of popcraft with Pet Sounds, and Bob Dylan continued pushing the boundaries of lyricism with Blonde on Blonde. The highest-profile pop artists of the time were exploring deeper and more expansive directions in songwriting and lyricism. Both the Beatles and the Kinks released some of their most beloved records, Revolver and Face to Face. Both groups were at the forefront of hip-hop music and found critical and financial success along the way. Acclaim would prove to come with some hang-ups, though, and in a weird twist of fate, both bands would write, record, and release songs about a singular issue suddenly affecting both groups: taxes.
The taxman's taken all my dough and left me in my stately home, blazing on a sunny afternoon.
These songs are, of course, the Beatles' Taxman and the Kinks' Sunny Afternoon. Under the UK's progressive tax, which is simply a tax rate that goes up as taxable income increases, individuals in the highest bracket could find themselves paying over 90% of their earnings to the government. This is more or less the position the Beatles and the Kinks, as fresh-faced rich and famous rock stars, found themselves in '66. George Harrison, despite his later image as a spiritual anti-materialism icon, was ironically known as the most pragmatic, money-focused Beatle at the time. And after discovering that the group was pissing away so much of their wealth to taxes, he was understandably peeved. He was particularly upset at the idea that his hard-earned Beatles cash was directly funding the UK government's military budget. This anger drove his inspiration to write Revolver's lead song and the Beatles' first political musical statement. Taxman kicks off the record with a countdown. Other than introducing the album on a vaguely psychedelic note with some trippy backwards guitar sounds, it's also a callback to how the group kicked off their debut record, Please Please Me. I Saw Her Standing There starts with Paul counting down the group, mimicking a live performance. Taxman's countdown is noticeably more subdued, almost sedated. By redoing the countdown that kicks off their most experimental LP to date, they were also symbolically kicking off the next phase of their career. Taxman is one of Harrison's most directly hostile songs. It's full of blunt takedowns designed to paint the UK government as oppressive, greedy slugs, stealing money out of the pocket of its citizens. Harrison sings from the perspective of the taxman and talks expressly to you, the listener, a choice that gives the song a unique, repulsive twist. The opening line, "There's one for you, 19 for me," is a reference to the 90% tax bracket the Beatles supposedly found themselves in. Harrison expanded on the frustration he felt from this. You're so happy that you finally started earning money, and then you find out about tax. In those days, we paid 19 shillings and 6 pence out of every pound. And with super tax and surtax and tax, it was ridiculous. A heavy penalty to pay for making money. Anybody who ever made any money moved to America or somewhere else. In 1969, Harrison even claimed that taxation drove him to be less creative. I know personally for me, there's no point in me going out and doing a job, doing a show, or doing a TV show, or anything, because in Britain, first of all, they can't afford to pay you. And whatever they do pay you is taxed so highly that it ends up that you owe them money. So why bother working? But if my tax is cut, then I do 4 times as much work, I'd make 4 times as much money. They'd take less tax, but they'd make more from me. But they cut their own throat. They do it all over the show. Every place you look in Britain, it's the same. Well, on its face, Taxman feels like the out-of-touch complaints of a rich and beloved Beatle. When the context of the UK's progressive tax scheme is brought into the equation, it does add some validity to Harrison's vitriol. Dennis Healey, who worked as defense secretary in the mid-60s and as chancellor of the exchequer in the mid-70s, reflected on the government's tax policies in the 60s and 70s and mirrored Harrison's claims. What I learned as chancellor was that the rich can nearly always find ways of avoiding tax that are legal. And in any case, the amount raised is very small, and it does encourage people to leave the country. He also went on to claim that the main effect was to get people to invest abroad rather than the UK, which was bad. Harrison wasn't the only Beatle to make their distaste of taxes known, too. According to the Beatles anthology, Ringo admits that the band got caught up in a tax evasion scheme. We went into one mad scheme where we paid a guy to go and live in the Bahamas and hold our money for us so it would be tax-free. And in the end, we had to bring all the money back, pay the taxes on it and this guy, so we might as well have just left it where it was. Lennon was also personally against paying tax. Taxman was an anti-establishment tax song. At the time, we weren't aware of the whole tax scene. I'm still not really aware of what goes on with taxes. We believe that if you earn it, you may as well keep it, unless there's a communal or communist or real Christian society. But while we're living in this, I protest against paying the government what I have to pay them. Now, my advice for those who die, declare the pennies on your eyes, was supposedly a reference to the UK's policy on inheritance tax, or the tax to one's estate after they die. The idea of being indebted to the government even upon death upset Harrison, especially considering what taxes he was already indebted to pay. It may also be an allusion to Charon's obol, the coin placed upon the mouths of the deceased before their burial as a bribe for the ferryman transporting souls across the river to the world of the dead. Taxman is also the first Beatles song to name-check real people. In the song, Lennon sings backup vocals calling out Mr. Wilson and Mr. Heath. These are references to the Labour Party's Harold Wilson, who was Prime Minister at the time, and Edward Heath, the leader of the Conservative Party, and who would be Prime Minister in 1970. The choice to call out current-day politicians was bold. Not only were they the biggest group in the world, they were still known as teeny boppers, almost exclusively singing upbeat love songs. Opening their latest album with an anti-establishment song calling out prominent political figures was certainly a heel turn. Robert Rodriguez, in his book Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll, suggests that Harrison's choice to model the song after the Adam West Batman theme was somewhat tongue-in-cheek. It's pretty likely that George was making a deliberate decision to call it out in Taxman, giving listeners a wink by letting them in on the joke that, real tax issues aside, his rant shouldn't be taken at face value. Despite the radical change in lyrical direction, Taxman is arguably even more important for its innovative new approach to the Beatles' sound. It's totally unlike anything the group had produced thus far. It has an acid-influenced vibe with a sharp, minimalistic guitar riff. Surprisingly, McCartney actually plays the guitar solo on this song, and it's easily one of the band's finest moments. With its more experimental approach, it shocks the track with life, and just sounds so different to the more accessible, pop-friendly material of their earlier days. Revolver also marks the band's extensive experimentation in the studio. It reportedly took 220 hours to record, over twice the amount of time spent on Rubber Soul. Just Taxman was recorded and put together in several sessions over several days spanning 2 months, as the group worked on the rest of the record. Coincidentally, Sunny Afternoon was recorded the same week the Beatles were working on part of Taxman, although the Kinks' process was seemingly far less sunny.
Help me sail away. Well, give me 2 good reasons why I ought to stay. 'Cause I love to live so pleasantly. Live this life of luxury, blazing on a sunny afternoon.
Ray Davies, who had hay fever at the time, did his vocals in a single take, claiming he couldn't have done another due to his sickness. He also says the band's bassist, Pete Quaife, flubbed some notes, and when he asked their producer, Shel Talmy, to do another take, he simply forced them to move on, saying, "Nobody will notice, it's just a fluff on bass." They recorded the song in just 3 hours, and it was released only a bit over a month later, a stark contrast to the obsessive studio perfection the Beatles had the luxury to achieve. While Taxman's satire is somewhat obscured, Sunny Afternoon is unmistakably meant to be a twisted joke. Where Harrison takes the perspective of the Taxman himself, Davies chooses to embody a victim of the state. But in typical Ray Davies fashion, he obscures his characterization with layers of sarcasm and irony. He dreamt up a fat cat aristocrat who, more than anything, seems full of self-pity.
And I can't sail my yacht. He's taken everything I got. All I've got's this sunny afternoon.
Where Harrison spits on the greediness of the state, Davies makes fun of the gluttony of the wealthy. Sunny Afternoon is not only criticizing the clearly selfish and abusive types like the protagonist, but also taking the piss of people in Davies and Harrison's position, who might complain about having the misfortune of being in the highest tax bracket. Of course, Harrison and Davies' path to wealth share little in common with this whiny nobleman. Neither Davies or Harrison were born into luxury. Instead, they were both from big families with working-class parents, and had reached their positions through their artistic acclaim and success. In his biography, Davis even claims he was brought up believing that all conservatives were cruel slave drivers who took advantage of the poor and cared little for the unfortunates on whom their whole financial empire had been built. While Davis clearly had contempt for the affluent whiner he created, on some personal level he still had something in common with this character. It was my imaginary character singing through me, just as it was in all my other new songs. As this was my first year of success, I could sympathize with the sad, decadent character I had invented. It seems like there is an intended twinge of self-pity present in Sunny Afternoon that gives it a more complex emotional basis in which to engage with. Although Davis felt some relatability to this character, he made sure his audience was not to sympathize with them, another contrast to Harrison's populist appeal on Taxman. If being a wealthy, tone-deaf aristocrat complaining about his yacht being seized wasn't hateable enough, he's also a domestic abuser.
My girlfriend's run up with my car and gone back to her ma and pa, telling tales of drunkenness and cruelty.
Sunny Afternoon also presents a Davis songwriting hallmark, a sentimental desire for simplicity. Waterloo Sunset, Village Green Preservation Society, 8 Man, among others, all share themes alluding to a yearning for easier times, sometimes satirical and sometimes not. Sunny Afternoon's appeal to simplicity is perhaps his most deceptive. Davis' character is a bit of an unreliable narrator. He presents the pleasure of a sunny afternoon as a tragedy. While it might not be enough for this guy, the idyllic scene of sipping a beer on a sunny day is a universal simplicity of life that many find desirable regardless of your tax bracket. This small appeal actually makes Sunny Afternoon more relatable than Taxman for me, since many of Harrison's complaints won't apply to most Beatles listeners anyways. Sunny Afternoon is considerably different musically than Taxman as well. Where Taxman is a progressive studio marvel with backwards effects and an aggressive Eastern-influenced guitar solo, Sunny Afternoon comes off as more traditionally Western in comparison, even to the Kinks' previous material. Described by Ray Davies as a music hall-esque track, it certainly carries a more old-school feel that contrasts its topical subject matter and is a bit of a precursor for the Kinks' continuing musical direction. By combining the Kinks' proto-punk garage rock origins with an overtly British conventionalism, they were trailblazing their own musical identity separate to the other UK groups of the day. Both are two of their respective groups' most enduring and interesting tracks. Taxman has inspired decades of discussion over its anti-greed, anti-government themes, and will still grab hold of you musically every time you give Revolver another spin. It's been co-opted by progressives and conservatives alike as an anthem for political upheaval. Sunny Afternoon is still considered one of the band's best songs, as well as one of the best of the 60s. It's even been used as the title of the jukebox musical about the story of the Kinks. For my money, Sunny Afternoon has more interesting, engaging, and nuanced lyrics. The general pathos of Taxman has still never really sat quite right with me. While a 90% tax does seem absurd and misguided, as a poor, complaints about taxes from wealthy famous people have always seemed a little tone-deaf, even though Harrison's concerns have some merit. The Kinks' take is much more my speed. It's witty and more nuanced than what you see on the surface. I do believe Taxman is the more interesting song musically, though, although I've always had a soft spot for the sing-song, pub-friendly attitude of Sunny Afternoon. Obviously, taxation remains a hot-button issue in the UK and pretty much everywhere else, and these two songs established Harrison and Davies as two of the smartest and most forward-thinking songwriters of their era.
In the summertime.